My name's Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. My own work has been mostly on understanding the global carbon cycle and the implications of that for climate change. But I've been really privileged over the last few years to be associated with the Woods Institute, where we take a really broad approach to understanding and providing practical solutions to issues related to climate, water, food, health, and oceans. You know, about 20 years ago, Stanford and other great universities recognized that traditional schools and departments are a really great way to encourage outstanding academics, to recognize professional accomplishments, and to do cutting-edge, inward-facing disciplinary work, but a really terrible way to solve important problems. And the right way to solve problems is to put an emphasis on practical approaches, to recognize that real solutions come from building unusual bridges that link people with expertise in diverse disciplines, and resourcing those people with not only the financial resources to work together, but with a culture that lets them take advantage of the potentials for conservation, conversations that link law and education and business and medicine. And that's what we try to do in the Institute. We've focused on issues that range from technical potential of renewable energy issues to the consequences of different kinds of legislative approaches to big policy issues. And we feel like we're making progress on some of the most important issues of our era. But today's conversation is going to be really different. It's one that I'm excited about, and the real focus is going to be on the influence of personal decisions in solving an environmental problem, and particularly contributing solutions to climate change. And, you know, I would say that overall there's a kind of an awkward balance between the role of big, ambitious policy initiatives and what individuals can do. And in some parts of the community, you see, well, you know, we need to have it be based on personal behavior change because that's how individual decisions get enacted. But at the other extreme, there's often a narrative that says, well, if solving climate change is about sacrifice, the number of people who we're going to get on board is going to be so limited that we'll never really address the big issues and especially the broad agenda for development that has to underlie the international approach. So today we're going to try and unfold this topic and see what the potential is for individual behavior change, what have been the kinds of factors that have limited the impact of behavior changes in the past, what have induced people to make the kinds of environmental choices that make climate change worse rather than contribute to the solutions, and what kind of new ideas are out there in order to enable us to move the ball forward, thinking about individual behavior change as part of a broad portfolio of solutions. Really excited to have an outstanding panel, and before I introduce them, I just want to say a couple things about the roadmap for how this morning's conversation will go. So the basic format, as you can tell, is truly a conversation, and we intend this as a conversation with all of you. I'm going to ask questions for about half of the session, and there'll be half of the time that's available for all of you. I hope that all of you start thinking from the very first about the questions that you're most curious about hearing the answers to. And the one piece of advice that I've been mandated to give before we start is that once we get into the Q&A session with all of you, please wait for the microphone. We are being videotaped, and we want to make sure that we don't miss the essence of what all of you are saying. So thrilled to have a truly distinguished and outstanding panel of experts on the topic of drivers, determinants, consequences of individual behaviors. To my far right is Gabrielle Wong-Perotti. Gabrielle's a new faculty member at Stanford. She joined us in early 2019. Gabrielle's an environmental psychologist who focuses on the decision aspects of personal behavior. She's worked on problems related to issues in mitigation, especially with oil and gas development, all the way to adaptation and coastal protection. Gabrielle came from adjunct professorship at Carnegie Mellon with her background in psychology from UC Berkeley. Next is Brett Jenks. Brett is the CEO of RARE, an environmental organization that's focused on behavior change. Under Brett's leadership, RARE has grown dramatically to be a lead player in the behavior space. Brett has a really distinguished career that includes stints as a journalist, as a filmmaker, as an ecotourism entrepreneur, and then for, I believe, nearly 20 years in RARE, where their new initiative is called Make It Personal, and it's really about how behavior change can help the U.S. meet the commitments of the Paris Agreement. And then to my immediate right is Margaret Walls, who's a scientist at Resources for the Future and a former Klutznick chair, is an environmental economist who's focused on a wide range of issues related to the valuation of nature and how to align the valuation with the broader objectives. Let me start with Gabrielle. A lot of your research has been focused on why people sometimes do and why people sometimes don't make the kind of decisions that make the most sense for protecting themselves, especially in the context of something like an impending hurricane. And I wonder if you can just open this conversation with some thoughts, especially about why people might make the wrong decisions that are leading in the opposite direction from those that are most protective of their own interests and their own health.
Okay, that's a lot to cover. So some of my work involves longitudinal studies assessing the impact of episodic acute events, so in this case hurricanes, as well as gradual environmental change in coastal areas, specifically in the Gulf Coast. And when we look at the types of protective behaviors that people can take, it could be evacuation behaviors, so these are kind of faster decisions that people have to make, all the way to thinking ahead a year down the line, what is the next hurricane season going to be like, and how am I going to think about protecting myself, my home, and my family? So when we look at some of the barriers or the reasons why, for example, people may not evacuate when they perhaps should evacuate, there are a host of individual or psychological, psychosocial reasons why people might not evacuate. And this might have to do with their sense of place attachment, their sense of not wanting to leave their home. There's a deep psychological need to kind of protect your home and to protect your family in that way. And then there are kind of contextuals or structural reasons why people might not leave. One thing that we found that was often a barrier to leaving, for example, in evacuation contexts, is that people have pets. And a lot of the shelters where people would go to if they could did not allow pets. And we saw this in the case of Hurricane Katrina. And so that's why we had a lot of people not leaving and getting stranded and creating a situation that was very dangerous for emergency personnel to go and to retrieve those individuals. There are also other psychological reasons why people may not leave. We are social beings, and we see this in the case across a lot of hazards. So for example, again, with hurricanes, but also tornadoes, we look and we see what the behavior of those around us in our neighborhoods are doing. So for example, if an impending storm is coming and I look outside and I talk to my friends and my neighbors and I see that nobody is panicking, nobody is doing anything, I'm more likely to say, oh, there's not a problem. I'm not going to leave. So those are some of the psychological processes that are at play. And then, of course, there are structural constraints. People may not have access to transportation. They may be socially isolated and not have people who could help them to prepare or to evacuate. And so at this kind of really fast decision-making level where we're talking about hurricanes and evacuation decisions, we see that those might be some barriers, but we see those processes playing out over time as well. Social networks are really important for being able to prepare in the long term. The resources that people have are really important for preparing for the long term. And when we tie this to understanding and the link between these kind of extreme events, and we're seeing increasing science suggesting that we can make these links between extreme events and climate change, and understanding the intensity and frequency of future events, we're seeing that there is some reluctance to make that link because of what it might mean for having to prepare, for having to change your lifestyle. And again, when we talk about those concepts of place attachment, it's very threatening for people to think about their homes, the place where they live, their identity as being threatened. So there are a lot of different sort of psychological, psychosocial processes and structural processes that are at play that prevent people from taking action that might actually help protect them and their families.
Great. Actually, that leads into what I wanted to start with Brett on. And Brett, you're a practitioner. Your goal is to find ways to enable the kinds of behaviors that really do make a difference. And Gabrielle's already described some of the barriers to that. How, as a practitioner, do you think about setting a stage that lets people make the decisions that are the most protective or make the most sense in terms of their big picture objectives?
So it's a great handoff. Gabrielle did a great job of outlining, I think, what is our working hypothesis, which is that if you went out and looked at as much research as you could gather and digest, if you distilled down the behavioral insights from evolutionary biology and social psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, you might end up with a short list, sort of exactly the way Gabrielle outlined. Emotional appeals are often more powerful than reason. Social influences or social incentives are some of the major drivers of human behavior. And then the timing of decisions and the context of decisions really matter. What Thaler and Sunstein called the potential of nudges in that terrific book 10 years ago. So practitioners need to be thinking about the context and timing of the decisions that they want to influence, and the social context and the potential levers of social influence, and then of course emotions like pride and joy as opposed to shame, as many of us would like to believe are actually really effective. We've built something that we call the Center for Behavior in the Environment, and in partnership with a whole host of academics and other practitioners around the world. And the goal is to take those three big buckets of insights and help translate the science so that practitioners can in fact design the interventions that are going to be most effective moving human behavior. So what that really looks like is a sort of a slightly different planning process, a slightly different assessment process. It starts off by looking at identifying the problem, and then the nature of the problem, and then the human nature of the problem. It requires a great deal of empathy, of listening, of not just stakeholder consultations, as we would like to say, but really deeply empathetically listening to for what might be the not so obvious challenges or obstacles. The love of pets, for example. I had never thought of the love of pets in a catastrophe situation as a reason for people to cling to their homes. That's a sign of it would take a while to get to that insight. And so the challenge, the opportunity then is, once you really understand the nature, the human nature of the problem, then it's a little easier to begin to think about emotional appeals. One quick example is I think RARE's known for running what we call a pride campaign. So we've run 450 different pride campaigns in about 60 countries all over the world. And unlike sort of a traditional conservation approach, which says there's a problem, you might be the problem, change is needed, please stop doing something. We tend to focus on, Pride Campaign tends to focus on instilling a sense of civic pride in nature and creating a sense of opportunity, a little bit of joy, a little bit of pride, a little bit of happiness, a sense of optimism, which makes people more interested in getting involved, more interested in being part of the opportunity for change. And turns out after leveraging that assumption for 20 years or so, we actually stumbled onto some literature that shows pretty clearly pride beats shame every day of the week as a motivator for humanity. But most of us don't really behave like that. Even the way we raise our children, we could learn a lot from emotional appeals. So I don't need to go on, but the point is there's so much to be learned as a practitioner from behavioral economics and social psychology and neuroscience. And your opening point, Chris, about the value of an interdisciplinary approach, without that you would never be able to harvest all of those insights and then bring them to practice.
Yeah, a really good point. And let's talk, Margaret, just for a minute about how all this plays out. As an economist, you count the number of people who move into these dangerous areas and try and understand what the factors that underlie their decisions are. And what can we say, for example, about the coastal populations and the factors that are leading us to an expanding coastal population, and at the same time that the climate risk should imply that people are rethinking where they should be located?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Probably one of our biggest problems we face in the climate adaptation world is how do we get people to live in areas that are less risky? And it's a complicated situation.
In California, we would never understand that kind of question.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe in many parts of the country. So some of my research and others' research has looked at sort of how people think about risks, and we all don't know the risks. We form a subjective assessment of what our risks are, whether it be smoking a cigarette, taking a scooter down the street, or living, living in a floodplain. And so two pieces of research I would talk about that I've done. One is based on a survey where we looked at what are people's subjective risk perceptions that live in the 100-year floodplain. And we did the survey in Maryland, and how does that affect their decision about flood insurance purchases. And then we did a sort of a formal test from the behavioral economics literature of what's called over-optimism. And that's where you are essentially, it is what it sounds like, but you're overly optimistic about your risks relative to other people. And so there's been some studies that have applied this method and shown things like people tend to think they're going to do better than the average on a test that they're taking.
Sorry.
And what we did is we applied this test to our survey where we looked at whether or not people who lived in the floodplain thought they were less at risk than their neighbors, other people that live in the floodplain. And in fact, we did find evidence of over-optimism. But if you think about it, there's also the fact that when people are thinking about their risks, they don't get hit with a flood all the time, right? So floods don't happen that often. Hurricanes don't happen that often. And when you're thinking about your risks, you may be perfectly rational and think about your subjective risks, and that gets updated over time as what? You get information, maybe your flood insurance rate goes up, or an event happens. And the event happening is really important. That's what many studies have found affects flood insurance purchases, house prices, where people live. If they experience an event, it's a big factor. But events don't happen very often. So to change people's behavior about where they live, whether they purchase flood insurance, you're sort of fighting that battle, if you will. I mean, that they don't get hit very often. And that's a good thing that they don't. But it's how do you combat that with information? How do you combat it with pricing? Is something that is a policy question that's difficult, and I don't think we've completely found the solution to. Maybe, as many people point out, we subsidize our flood insurance. That's a problem. How much it's a problem is unclear. Not very many people even buy flood insurance who live in the floodplain. So,
actually, maybe we can continue with that theme. Gabriella, a lot of what Margaret's emphasized is the importance of personal experience with an event, and I think a lot of the challenge with proactive action on climate change is figuring out how to get ahead of the curve, how to have people internalize the sense that there are important actions they can take and important risks they face. What's been your experience with sort of, well, I'll use the rare phrase of making it real, and finding pathways so that the abstract possibility of climate impact is actionable from a personal level?
Yes, there are definitely strategies that can be taken to make the risk, especially for rare events, seem more real and more salient. So here we can draw on something called construal level theory and this concept of psychological distance. And
they're trying to find out where that's happening. Stop it. They don't know where it's happening.
It's a hell of an iPhone
That's
charger.
It seems to be getting louder.
It's a risk management test.
So the issue with climate change and with impacts is that a lot of us think, oh, it's happening over there to somebody else far in the future. It's not happening to me and people that I care about. So psychological distance suggests that there are 4 dimensions, and if you reduce the distance on these 4 dimensions, you can make issues more salient for people and make them feel perhaps even more motivated to take action. So that has to do with certainty. You want to make that information more certain in some way. It has to do with a temporal or a time aspect. You need to draw that information and make it seem like it's going to happen closer in time. There is a social aspect. So it's not just happening to people over there, it's happening to me and people that I know and people that I care about. These dimensions, if you can draw them closer to individuals, excuse me, I forgot another aspect, a spatial aspect. So it's happening closer to where I live. So if you can reduce those dimensions, you can help people better understand those risks. And there are a variety of ways to do this. A very promising avenue for doing this are visualizations. So perhaps some of you or many of you have seen these decision support tools. They're these mapping tools which help people understand or better understand the risk, for example, in the context of coastal flooding, their risk of sea level rise and what those impacts are likely to be. So that type of information has been shown to enhance people's concern and awareness of the risks that they face. But what's really important is that you need to also offer them solutions that are behaviorally realistic and consistent with the resources that they have, their context. So you're not going to, for example, offer solutions that aren't feasible for people, that are very, very expensive. So what good is telling me to raise my home on pilings if I'm a renter? That's just not realistic for me. It's not relevant to me. So you need to provide information with people for things and steps they can take that are actually actionable.
That's great. Brett, I'd like to return to the theme you introduced about the different potency of positive versus negative emotions and the contrast between pride and shame in the context of dealing with risk, where we're trying to motivate a particular action to decrease emissions. I can see a clear avenue where enhancing the positive emotions really works. And how do you think about that in the context of, for example, coastal flood risk, where we're trying, the goal should be to encourage people to protect themselves, but it's harder to figure out how to have the positive emotion be the leading one?
That's a difficult one. I think our emphasis has really been on the narrative of climate change today in America, and the sense, I imagine in your conversations over the last couple of months, you've probably heard a very similar theme. Most Americans feel like, A, we're screwed. B, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing we can do. We can vote in 2020. We can vote again in 2022 with greater emphasis. If we're really desperate, we will vote again in 2024. And hopefully, by March of 2025, we will have the pieces in place to get comprehensive climate legislation. Now, maybe that's a slightly less optimistic view of the politics of climate change right now. But let's just say that's one scenario. And for the average American, that's a long time to wait, feeling like there's nothing you can do. So what if we were able to establish a new narrative, one that says, by the way, in your daily life, there are a handful of things you could do that would measurably move the needle, that would potentially, if we got 10% of Americans to follow suit, we could potentially move the meter enough to get us back on track to hitting our target, the US target, under the Paris Agreement. And when people see the data or hear a story that illustrates, a chart that illustrates that, they tend to sit up and say, well, why isn't anyone telling me this? In fact, there are many op-eds in the New York Times, across the country. There have been many over the last 3 or 4 months by leading scientists, which would tell people, tell the individual, don't kid yourself. Your diet is not going to change the world. Don't kid yourself. Thinking about buying an electric vehicle is not going to get there. All eyes need to stay on the prize, and the prize is electoral politics, and the prize is comprehensive climate legislation. Well, that in fact is partially true, that it is critically important that we reform all the laws associated with climate change. But it is also true that we, the people, actually have a really significant role to play. So we did an analysis over the last 3 months that shows 7 behaviors, if adopted by 10% of Americans, would move the meter, would reduce potentially nearly a gigaton of carbon from the atmosphere over the course of a year. If you add that up over a number of years, we're getting well on our way to be back on track. Adopt a plant-rich, we've organized them from A to G. So adopt a plant-rich diet, buy carbon offsets, contract for green energy, meaning renewable energy credits or solar on your rooftop. Don't waste food, electrify your vehicle, and fly less once. That's really targeting the serious business travelers who do most of our traveling. 6 really simple behaviors so far, relatively pro-consumer behaviors. And G, so it's A to G, is make sure you tell everybody you're doing these things. Use social media to leverage what is potentially the most powerful of behavioral phenomena, which for humans, which is dynamic norms. And I think this is directly relevant to what Gabrielle said. And if you think about a catastrophe and people fleeing the coast, people don't flee the theater because they see smoke. They flee the theater when they see everyone else fleeing the theater. The same can be used in a positive, the same behavioral insight can be used in a positive way, which is when we see people beginning to adopt new pro-climate behaviors, we will very likely ask ourselves a new question, which is, why am I not following suit? We're herd-like, we're tribal. We've all been watching these shows since we were kids. We know what happens on the savannah when you're left behind, right? We don't want to be left behind socially or morally. So we need to create a myth of inevitability that we, the people, are shifting our behavior. We are changing. And if we just got 10% of Americans to adopt a set of these behaviors and begin sharing their stories, that would move the meter, and it might make the electoral proposition easier. That's a topic for another day.
Really interesting. Let me stick with this theme of the positive motivators and the herd instinct and come back to the coastal risks. And I do want to move eventually to more of the proactive mitigation side, but when we think about coastal risks, a lot of the challenge is that it's seen as requiring extra investment, requiring living in potentially a less attractive setting. And I wonder if Margaret, you've thought about ways to reformulate the issue of coastal risks so that there can be a positive framing to taking protective steps or to living in a safer location.
I have not thought about the positive framing. As an economist, I would say, the pricing mechanisms are really going to have to come into play for permanent change by a large number of people, whether that be in terms of climate adaptation and risk evaluation and where people live, or whether it's on the mitigation side and we need people to eat a plant-rich diet or drive an electric vehicle or have solar panels. I believe those are motivators in combination with the social influences. I think the problem on the coast and these decisions about, like there's three things we can do. One is we can relocate to a less risky area. The second is that we can try to elevate our homes and do flood proofing and do the things that we might be able to do. And the third is, well, there really isn't a third. Those are the two options that you have to deal with the problem. The third involves flood insurance to insure yourself, but you're still going to get impacted if you're hit by a storm. And another part of my research, and others have, this will make sense to any economist, is that the problem in terms of getting relocation to happen is that you can get people to relocate, land prices drop, and new people move in. And those people tend to be the poorer people, because then we're seeing that play out in certain areas in Miami. There have been stories about this. We've shown this in some simulation modeling where, you know, people are drawn to the coast for amenities, but they realize there's storm risks, and let's suppose they're perfectly rational and figure it out and storms get worse, they might relocate. Then the prices get cheaper, and then somebody's going to move in. There's, you know, the house is there, we've already developed a lot, so how are we going to deal with that inequity in the problem? So I don't think in terms of this issue of coastal adaptation that these positive messages or reinforcement are going to be enough. Like, that's a problem that probably needs a little bit more policy at the federal level, policy at the local level, in particular our land use planning and zoning regulations need some work.
Yeah,
Can I just add to that? I apologize, I didn't clearly answer your first question, Chris. And I realized that in the context of coastal risk and adaptation, we've actually, RARE has been working about the last 8 years with probably more than 1 million people in 250 communities across the island nations of Indonesia, the Philippines, Brazil, Mozambique, and the like, probably 7 or 8 countries. And, you know, what we have learned is that having a very positive orientation around the collective value of, the value of collective action around, number one, celebrating coastal communities and their culture and the natural resources on which they depend. 2, creating a more of a collective understanding and vision for governance of those resources, sort of literally redoing marine spatial planning so that the community understands and can manage where it fishes and where it doesn't fish, which leads to greater protection of mangroves, which leads to replanting of mangroves, which leads to greater protection of coral reefs, and which leads to greater protection of seagrass beds, all of which redound economically, bring benefits to the local fishers and their communities. That whole very positive approach, not fear-based, but sustainability-based, the notion that I, as an individual, can make a difference if I am working with my community. If you were to assess the resilience of these communities, technically, what you would see is within 5 or 6 years, they're way more biologically resilient. Biomass has come up, fisheries have repopulated, the health of biodiversity has improved. They are economically more resilient, now having control over local natural resources and having some semblance of governance. There's a greater predictability for their economy. And so they're able to begin to invest in their fisheries. So you have biological resilience, ecological resilience, and then probably most important in the time of a storm or a catastrophic event, you have social resilience, because people have been working together, not sitting home alone managing their accounts, working with savings clubs, working on management bodies, working on enforcement bodies. And what we have seen, because the Philippines gets hit with on average 12 typhoons a year, we have seen resilience in action. I would say that's probably other than relocation.
Yeah.
Probably the greatest investment we can make in coastal people is their own coastal biological, economic, and social resilience.
And Gabrielle, you already spoke some about this challenge of building social resilience. And I know you've thought a lot about the kind of information that makes an impact versus the kind that doesn't. In the area of climate-related risks, whether it's coastal or wildfire, what are the kinds of information that let people start along the trajectory that Brett's described?
I mean, in terms of building social resilience, or in terms of
being oriented toward taking effective action, let's say.
Well, in the context of adaptation, taking effective action, it's something that I mentioned before. It's linking the awareness of the risk that people face with plausible, behaviorally realistic solutions that they can take. And then Margaret talked a bit about regulations that we may need. It also takes the role of local emergency planners and local officials to provide the structure in which people can operate and have the transportation that they need, build in those social institutions that people can rely on when disaster strikes, and to be aware of the heterogeneity within a population, that people aren't all the same. They don't have all the resources. When we're seeing these storms come again and again, and you're totally right, those that can leave and have the resources to leave do so. Poor individuals move in, and then those who are very wealthy can stay because they can protect themselves, they can armor themselves. So that's with respect to adaptation. With respect to climate mitigation in general, some positive steps that people can take, because when you were talking, you were making me think of prospect theory, and you were making me think of this notion that losses are felt more keenly than gains. And so this idea of negative framing can be effective in terms of making people aware of the risk, but it's not necessarily effective in terms of motivating change. So really providing people with positive steps that they can take, the gains that they're likely to experience, both personally and also in their social networks and society at large. I think that those are really powerful motivators. And again, thinking kind of structural things that we need to do, regulations we may need to have, people tend to anchor on the information that they have. And so how we present information and how we present the solutions that people could potentially take, people are going to anchor and adjust based on what they know and the information that they have. So it's important that, to use things like defaults and to think more strategically about how we present the solutions so that people can take those positive steps.
And Margaret, in many ways, this conversation, I would say, is setting up almost two alternative views of the world. One is the sort of rational economic viewpoint, and at the other extreme is one where people make decisions based on self-validation, pride, love of their family. And how, as an economist, do you think about understanding the way that decision-making can be anywhere along that spectrum, and it can be different at different times?
Yeah, I think all of the above is important. And I think my view, when I the differences you're hearing here, I think is when we're talking about the climate problem and mitigation and the changes we need people to make, we need everybody to be doing things. And some people respond to some things and some people respond to others, and in different settings. It can matter. Your social network can matter. If I see my neighbor with solar panels, maybe that motivates me, maybe it doesn't. If I'm given a subsidy, maybe that motivates somebody, maybe it doesn't motivate somebody else. So I think because we can tell stories about behavior change, but we need everybody's behavior to change. So, and we do have a heterogeneous population, as Gabrielle pointed out. So, you know, what works for some and might not be the same thing that works for others. I just want to share an anecdote. I'm wondering if anybody who's on Twitter, like I am, saw a tweet earlier this week, and I wonder if you guys saw this and could speak to it, but it was somebody I didn't know who okay, so somebody tweeted, airfares to Lisbon are only $250. Should I make a trip? I don't really want to make a trip, but it's so cheap, maybe I'll go. And I don't know who this person was, but somebody blasted him for this, basically saying, this is our problem we have, and this is why we have a climate problem. You're making unnecessary trips. And it was a really harshly worded reply. And did anybody see this? You saw it? Okay, because it really made the rounds. And then there were lots of replies to that were saying things like, if you think that's going to motivate people, that's not going to work. And it was a really interesting behavioral discussion about this tweet, about what would work. Does it work to shame somebody? And a lot of the replies were indicating, we don't think it's going to work. You're not going to change anybody's behavior. It just was a really interesting little story to. Everybody uses a different method. On Twitter, you're pretty anonymous, so he can blast that person, right? But,
yeah. And Brett, how do you think about the fact that different people use different decision-making criteria, and a strong motivator for you might not be a motivator at all for Margaret?
Yes.
Not to pick on Margaret, but.
Yes, there's no question. I think there's no right answer. There's no one way. Just ask yourself, in your family, and with your 3 best friends, would you use the same approach to get them to do something you wanted to do? Whether it's the trash, the dishes, going out for a glass of wine, you're going to moderate and mitigate, and you're going to think about what it takes to move people. And some people are very good at that, and some people are not very good at that. But we're also all very different. And so there is no holy grail. There's no unifying theory of human behavior change. Someday there might be, but we're not there yet. And so the way we think about behavior change is there's a, my favorite way to think about it is with a Spanish axiom, which is según el sapo va la pedrada, which is what I learned when I lived in a rural community in Mexico, and that is what little boys would say. You pick the rock based on the size of the frog that you're trying to knock out of the tree. So form follows function is the point. And there's a way to think about bringing to bear all that we don't know as as experts in our own domain. And so, my fantasy is to have sitting around the table as we're designing these interventions, a behavioral designer, a social psychologist, a neuroscientist, a behavioral economist. So we're not just taking an economics approach. We're not homo economicus. We're not rational. Why are you wearing the clothes that you're wearing today? It has very little to do with the price point, though we're conditioned to believe it is. Why did you pick the car that you drove, or decided not to, why did you decide not to drive today? So much of that has to do with social influences. So for example, we've done some polling in the last couple of weeks that shows, you think of that list of behaviors that I mentioned earlier, the A to G. More than 60% of Americans, when polled, believe, regardless of political affiliation, we should do those things because they are the right thing to do. And yet, the average American believes that only about 20% of Americans agree with them. So 60% of Americans believe we should be doing the right thing, but nobody believes that anyone else shares that belief. That gap in social expectation is just another variable that we're not leveraging right now. So from an adaptation standpoint, from getting people off the coast prior to a storm, how many people are proud to say, I'm not leaving? That's a source of pride.
Yeah.
How do you flip that on its head? And the gentleman who says that, and that sounds like something a gentleman would say, the wonderful lady who lives next door to him might believe differently, but how do you create an intervention that's going to speak to both of them? And so there's also the art of sequencing messaging, so that your innovators and your early adopters in this, this adoption curve are going to get one kind of message. And as the norm begins to shift, maybe the early majority is going to get a different kind of message. The same way the first Geico ad 10 years ago is very different from the Geico ad today, right? So it's very complex. I mean, this is about as difficult a challenge. This is the most difficult challenge in the history of humanity, bar none. Two major problems that make this so difficult. Number one, it's so monumental, it's so existential, that no one believes that I matter. Two, it's so big that it requires collective action. You said earlier, we all have to change, which means I don't matter to it, right? So it's a monumental challenge. And with 7.5 billion people, we need policy change. We need social inducements. We need to create a myth of inevitability that which the same-sex marriage movement was able to create in a very short order. What does that take? What does that take? So it's emotional appeals, it's social influence, and it's what you could technically call choice architecture. That's at least the beginnings of an interdisciplinary toolkit. But we all have a lot of homework to do if we're going to figure out. If I could say just plant one seed over the next year for our 7.5 billion comrades in arms around the planet, it would be, we have to get really good at shifting human behavior if we're going to be able to stay ahead, if we're going to grow our ability to change to keep up with the technology that we have now unleashed. That's the fundamental gap. That's the existential crisis for humanity.
Gabrielle, I can see you want to jump in.
Okay, I'm loving this conversation. We're talking about the difference between kind of hot and cold or fast and slow thinking. The research in my field suggests that every decision is emotional. We need emotion to capture our attention in order to make a decision. Emotion is very important. And the research also suggests, at least in my field, that the decisions people make are eminently rational. They make sense, to preserve our social structures, to preserve relationships, to present yourself to the world in the way that you want to be seen. So I think people tend to do things fairly rationally. It makes sense to them and to their context. There are a few things that I want to mention which I think might be important and are relevant to some of the conversation that we had last night over dinner. And that is, I mentioned earlier this idea of a psychological distance. That is the idea of understanding who people are in terms of their values. And so emotional appeals and a value appeal are really important. And I'll give you an example of a study that I did a couple years ago looking at how do we motivate citizen engagement on clean energy. And we did a field experiment in Florida, Michigan, and California. I think I may have too many mics going on, I don't know. Where we were interested in seeing if we could move people up, basically, the ladder of engagement. So wanting to learn more about clean energy, wanting to sign a petition on clean energy, to actually calling their local utilities and leaving a message for the CEO demanding change. And so what we did was to present an appeal in ways that we had hypothesized would be appealing for various audiences. So for example, we did an appeal in the state of Florida where we tied sea level rise to clean energy. In Michigan, we tied clean coal to the health of people's children. In California, we tested a variety of messages, and in each of those states, talking about sea level rise in Florida was the most effective. Talking about clean coal and the impact to children was the most effective in Michigan. And it seemed like all the messages were effective in California, which we found kind of amusing. So that's just one way we can think about, okay, well, how do we engage audiences that are heterogeneous? What do they care about? appealing to those values is really important. Another thing that I'm doing in some research that hopefully will get funded, it's looking very likely, that's thinking about how people learn best, the power of narratives, the power of story, the power of art. And so in this particular study, we are going to be reaching, so this is also your audience, the power of children in influencing their parents' decision making. So we are going to be doing this study where we've actually already created a play called Rollover, which is about sea level rise and an impending hurricane that's coming and the steps that people can take to reduce their risk. And we're going to be showing this in North Carolina, and we're actually also coupling this with a virtual reality experience. So we're doing an experiment with high schoolers and with adults to see, is this type of storytelling, is this type of narrative powerful, and how is this likely, hopefully, going to influence their parents' decisions around coastal protection? So there are a variety of strategies that we can take. I think there's a lot to be hopeful about in terms of moving the dial on climate change and hopefully encouraging people to take a fresh look at this and to feel empowered to make change.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to hand the questioning off to all of you. So now's your last best chance to start thinking about your question. And Margaret, I don't mean to single you out as the economist, but I would say that the theme of much of this morning's conversation has been that traditional economic rationalist approaches are either not entirely useful, or sometimes have sort of led us astray in thinking about how to drive the changes that are really going to make a difference. And I wonder if you want to, from the perspective of an economist, sort of put that in context.
Yeah, I think that's true. I want to say that most economists are not in the homo economicus world anymore anyway. Everybody's recognizing behavioral science writ large, and the alternative models, you mentioned prospect theory and many others that are built into much of the thinking of the standard economists these days. And especially in the space we're talking about. So if we're talking about issues related to the energy efficiency gap and why people don't, invest in things that seem to save them money over the long run, that cost a little more up front. And there's a lot of work in thinking through how are people making decisions that might fit what looks like irrational behavior. And it's so I think that the profession itself has moved on. Nonetheless, I think probably the profession, I would say I'm in this, feels the power of the purse is pretty strong. And so we need to recognize that some sort of, for example, to solve the climate problem, some sort of carbon pricing approach is probably necessary. And is it sufficient? No, it's not sufficient. It's probably not sufficient at all. And I think there's been a recent study that came out that showed even at a $200 a ton price or something changes will not get made. So we need to think about all of the other things that are going to change people's understanding that are beyond really what a price mechanism is going to do. That's my own opinion. I think it would be a pretty standard opinion among most environmental economists these days.
Yeah, I think that just as the closing this chapter of the conversation, this sense of the need for a comprehensive approach with a wide range of signals and a wide range of mechanisms to encourage action is a really good way to think about it. I want to turn it over to all of you. When you ask a question, please tell us who you are first and wait for the microphone. So why don't we start here?
Thanks very much for doing this. Randy Shostak, I'm a reporter with EOS over at the American Geophysical Union. So my question is for all of the panelists, and some of you touched upon this a bit. With there being such a sharply divided U.S. electorate, I'm wondering, are there, and if so, what are they, different behavioral approaches, cautions, and messages, for instance, for Democrats and Republicans, or if you want to rephrase it, liberals and conservatives, related to concern for and taking action about climate change, among other issues? Gabrielle,
I see you're moving the microphone. Are you ready to comment on that?
Oh, I mean, there is a lot of research looking at how to engage skeptical audiences, climate skeptics. And I think Brett alluded to this, and the Yale Climate Change Center has also done a lot of research on this. Most people actually think climate change is happening. And in fact, a growing number of Republicans and conservatives also think climate change is happening. What is, I think the differences we see is with respect to what the response should be, as well as with respect to what is potentially causing it. And so there, oh gosh, I guess this was in 2009 or 2010, a series of studies that were done looking at how to engage skeptical audiences, and I've done some of this work as well. And there is a theory called system justification theory, which basically suggests that there's a strong desire to keep the status quo, to keep things as they are. And these particular set of studies done by one of my colleagues, Irina Fagina, found that when you, again, kind of casting things in a positive light and talk about the economic benefits of taking actions, kind of concept of green economy, job creation, energy independence, those types of things, those are potentially more appealing for people who have a strong sense of system justification and status quo. So there are strategies that you can take, and I think the big take-home message is that you need to investigate and know your audience, and to have messages that are targeted and perhaps sequenced according to kind of thinking through who are likely to be the early adopters. I think all of those things are really important.
I would add, I feel the need to be very careful here. I'm sitting between two scientists and the head of the Woods Institute, and I'm a lowly practitioner. I will say what we have learned is that through our polling and through our early design work on a climate behavior change campaign, that people tend to get stuck in the United States right now over one variable, and that is whether climate change is human caused or not. That is sort of the remaining obstacle to a more fully aligned country. And I think pushing hard on that is not a good idea. I think there are a growing personal opinion, there are a growing number of Republicans who believe climate change is happening, know climate change is happening, who would benefit from a very soft off-ramp intellectually, socially, culturally, that would enable them to move forward with the herd to begin to address this challenge. But politically, that is very difficult. Socially, in a number of communities, that is very difficult. And so I think pushing harder in that direction is futile at this point. Our research is finding that most of the behaviors that I mentioned, in fact, none of the behaviors I mentioned are politicized right now. And that's a source of opportunity. And I think the third part of our theory of change would, quite simply, would be I have not, in my experience, coming from Southern Ohio, ever experienced an ability to talk someone into a new belief. I don't think you can argue someone into a new belief. I believe that we tend, and some research has shown, with interpersonal behavior, sexual behavior, for example, some research has shown people tend to rationalize their way into new beliefs by experimenting with new behaviors. That can be shopping, it can be sexual, it can be really minor, it can be really major, but people tend to, there's a researcher and a good friend named Arvind Singhal at UTEP in El Paso, who likes to say people act their way into new beliefs. And I think there's something to be said for getting at climate change in a more orthogonal way. We've been pushing those policy levers in that debate for 3 decades. We shouldn't stop, and there are groups really well equipped to do that. but I think that there's one regiment in this little battle should definitely be focused on more orthogonal social approaches that will enable us to essentially give people license to begin to behave as if climate change actually mattered, so that one day when asked they can say, of course I believe, and it's an instinctive response because they've shifted their identity even subconsciously. We're not talking about manipulation. We're talking about an encouraging way, an enabling way for people to join the club because we need them to.
The one thing I'll just add is that I think we're maybe the biggest contrast between people on different parts of the political spectrum is the question of whether the solutions are primarily about sacrifice or taking advantage of opportunity. And there really is a narrative about sacrifice, that solving climate means nature coming back and having its victory. It means giving up on the things you care about. But if you look at the kinds of behaviors that Brett's advocating, and you look at where we are with the pricing of the renewable energy technologies and efficient vehicles, it's mainly a question about capitalizing on new technologies, being a positivist, and there are environmental issues where trade-offs do involve sacrifice, but climate really isn't the main one. And I think that contrasting narrative about whether it's sacrifice or not is really probably the most important distinguishing one, and I think it's the one that strikes me as sort of least substantiated. It's frustrating that we're sort of trapped in that. Next question. A couple over here. Natalie, you can choose.
Hi, Kathleen Johnson with the Environmental Protection Agency. Several of us here are from EPA, specifically with the Enforcement and Compliance Office.
Thank you for coming.
And I'm curious, we've talked about behavioral issues. Companies are run by individuals. What do you think, do the economies of competition cut off these behavioral triggers when you get into the corporate world? Or does it still work the same way? You know, the pride versus shame. What's your sense of, does that work in the corporate world?
I'll take a little bit of a stab at that. I think a lot of things are working in the corporate world. Their corporate social responsibility is a real thing. It affects their stock prices. I think there's studies that have shown that. I think corporations are probably more homo economicus when in terms of sort of the bottom line, and so saving energy on your energy bill matters a lot. It's a bigger bill, for one thing, for many companies. You probably saw the story about was it Google with the renewable energy in Georgia, and it's sort of filtering out for everybody to see, and sort of motivating others to take on that. What I have heard, though, is that sometimes within companies, the person sort of in charge of the corporate social responsibility part is not integrated with the whole rest of the firm. And so although there's a bottom line motivation a lot of times, sort of getting that, maybe we have some people here who can speak to this more than me since I work for a nonprofit, but getting that as actually integral to the way the firm operates is sometimes a bit of a challenge. I think that's worked in a lot of places, but it's a hurdle in others. So I think there's a lot going on, but I think there's internal management structures that keep it from being as strong a thing as it could be. That's one thing I have to say about that. I don't know if anybody else.
I have a couple of thoughts. So in terms of at the corporate level and the internal practices for thinking about climate change, and most of the work that I've done has had to do with energy efficiency and conservation behavior. At least at the level of universities that I've been working with, there are a lot of things like energy dashboards that are used to kind of engage with employees, where people are encouraged to save energy. There are things that are being done to leverage social norms. So energy feedback. How much energy am I consuming compared to my neighbor? There are a lot of things that I'm seeing in the movement towards energy efficiency retrofits that are happening in buildings. So, and I think a lot of the lessons that were learned on individual decision making in the residential sector and other sectors is also playing out in the commercial sector and industrial sector as well. So I've done some research looking at why commercial A, B, and C office buildings have energy retrofits, and corporate responsibility is one of the reasons, but also the influence of other people who are your competitors is also very important. So am I investing in getting LEED certification? Is that building over there doing it? They're sort of this shining example. They're going to get more tenants, et cetera, et cetera. So these types of things are happening. There is movement that I'm seeing, and social influence is very important, as well as the bottom line. That we see that as being a big motivator as well.
Let me take another question. Was there one over on that side of the room? Okay, we'll come back to the middle here then.
Thank you. I'm Kirsten Rumsey. I work for Grid Alternatives, a solar power nonprofit in DC. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about voting as an action and how you motivate people to vote on climate action and environment as sort of their priority issue as opposed to other issues that take over elections.
Who wants to start on that
Who
one?
wants to take that one?
Okay. So I do a lot of studies, and we do ask about your support for climate policy, as well as, and lately we've been asking who have you actually voted for. And so with respect to the work that I've done in coastal areas, and what we are seeing, and this is just, we're not trying to encourage people to consider climate change. What we're seeing is an increasing number of people making the link between extreme weather events and climate change. And that is affecting how they see climate change and their support for policy. So I've seen this in my own studies, and we're kind of seeing this in other studies that have been done in the last 2 or 3 years. So I don't specifically study voting behavior, but I could turn your attention to colleagues that do, if you're interested in that.
Other comments?
I'll just say there's a number of people out there working on that specific issue right now, and I think there's an array of strategies and theories of change. All of them involve some combination of sort of identity and messaging and micro-targeting using social media. Some are designing specific campaigns in between election cycles where you can get a higher ROI on your marketing and advertising investment to try to point to, on the one hand, rising insurance prices, the specter of sea level rise, for example, in Florida, to try to make it more personal, more temporal, more close to home, more direct, and to create a narrative that would have someone want to identify in a new way as they vote. I think there's a number of other folks who are really practical and just focused on getting out the vote, not worried whether it's the reason people are voting, but recognizing that certain demographics, certain psychographics are way more likely to vote in the right direction if that's your aim. So there's a lot of innovation and a lot of money being spent right now to answer that question. And I would say you could take the same emotional appeals, social influence, and choice architecture, nudging, and you could probably identify within those 3 areas each of the strategies. So I think it provides an interesting window for analyzing the approach being taken by each of those corresponding strategies.
I'll just say something real quickly on that point, and I think it's not an issue I work on in my own research, but you know, we need, and we all know this, but we need the climate issue to be something that reporters are asking candidates about, that is always front and center, because voters are going to think quick, you know, they're making a decision. If they're talking, if everything's about health care, for example, that might be their motivation. Everybody votes for a whole variety of reasons. So I think the issue itself, you know, we know that it wasn't brought up in the, you know, 2016 debates. It needs to be brought up in every debate and so forth.
Yeah, the one other thing that I believe is worth thinking about in the context of all of the comments here is that there are a number of features of climate change that make it kind of unfriendly from an electoral cycle perspective. The solutions tend to be long-term. They tend to be ones where each individual has trouble understanding why he or she makes a real difference. And I think that a lot of the comments here have really opened up the reasons that the narrative shouldn't be that anymore, that there are compelling, optimistic solutions that individuals can take, and I hope that that will change the spectrum of the way that climate enters electoral politics. Let's go back over here, way back in the back there.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a student, but I'm working at the Audubon Society this summer. And my question is for any of the panelists, and it involves an issue that's kind of come up more recently in the climate change conversation, which is environmental justice. And, you know, in thinking about solutions to it, the issue seems very salient to these communities. Gabrielle, you talked a little bit about like the dimensions and how, you know, it's a certain issue. We can see the smokestack in the communities. It's spatial, you know, it's close by. And then so my next question goes, is it just a matter of resource availability in terms of time and money for these communities? But my questions for you guys is more, is there some other psychological or from a behavioral economic perspective on how to address this issue? And is there like a power dynamic that comes into play as well?
Great, thank you.
Can I take one quick thing and
Yeah.
then I'll turn it over? And that is, I think, a really important issue, the environmental justice issue. And something that I've heard, and I'd like these guys to say something about, is that a lot of times in communities, they see the climate issue and the climate policy proposals as separate, as, oh, you're going to solve that problem, which is a big global problem and down the road, and nobody's solving the fact that I live next to this refinery that's spewing out whatever. So I have heard that, which is a little, I think, maybe the opposite of what you said, that you're not really solving the things that have affected me for a long time in my community. So I'm very sympathetic to that, and I think there's some way in which we need to make people understand that, yeah, that problem needs to be solved, but they probably have some complementary benefits if we deal with both of them. But
Yeah, this is something that I think is a huge issue, and I didn't mention this before, but in a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, we're also assessing people's mental and physical health as well, and we're seeing obvious disparities with respect to the health impacts of these extreme events on vulnerable populations and their ability to cope with those events, kind of in the immediacy of those events, as well as the long-term prospects for them in terms of mental health outcomes. So, for example, in areas in post-Harvey where there was a lot of flood inundation, who were the people who were least able to recover from those events and least able to rebuild? And we're seeing the lingering effects of worry immediately after the event, but then post-traumatic stress a year later, and then their ability to cope and think ahead, how am I going to protect myself? With respect to the work that we're doing in California, we're designing a study where we're going to be following people, about 1,000 people, in the aftermath of wildfire events and also smoke impacts. And we're going to be focusing part of the work looking at people who work outdoors. And who are those individuals that work outdoors? They tend to be, in California, transient workers, perhaps they're undocumented citizens. So these are our most vulnerable populations. And so there's more and more work looking at the health impacts of climate change on these populations, and then thinking through how do we provide support for those populations so that they can make informed decisions and so that we have the policies and the social structure there to help those individuals. So this is something that should be thought about a lot, and I think we're moving in that direction, and I think more research and support needs to be done.
I would just add, I think climate change is the social justice problem of humanity. It's the greatest social injustice of humanity. We work, think of a coastal community in the Philippines where the average person doesn't have electricity in their home, doesn't have a car, and they are inundated by a growing torrent of deeply intensifying typhoons. Or take a coastal community in one of the poorest countries in the entire planet, in Mozambique, in a little town of Beira, where we were about to open an office, literally a month before that storm came through. And you consider that 10% of Americans produce, 50 to 60% of all of our emissions. That's the nature of the problem. And that the U.S. per capita presents, we are the gravest of contributors. And so that's social injustice, that's climate injustice. I think the challenge, once you recognize that though, the question is that a fact or is that your messaging, right? I think that's the fact. How to bring about change is a very different question. And I think recognizing an injustice and addressing an injustice, and there are competing views, obviously, and I don't know the answer, but there are competing views on what is the right way to galvanize, to mobilize, and what we're all swimming in right now. Or if you watch the Democratic first of the two CNN debates last night, we're swimming in communications and policy prescription soup right now. The question being, do we address this injustice through a Rust Belt jobs program, which several of the candidates last night talked about? Or is this a more ethereal question of just recognizing an injustice and then mobilizing, switching the gears of our taxation system to address the problem? Or is it something else? And I think we're all going to have our own views, but it is, bottom line, that is what makes this so existential.
Yeah. Super important question. I think the fundamental challenge is one that we've been talking about, that people really are tribal in the way they think about things, and even sort of an abstract philosophical stance that one's committed to environmental justice and to a global fair distribution. It's really hard to connect that with individual decisions, and it has to do with a wide range of domains that go all the way from your religious affiliation to your core beliefs that are it's going to be really, really hard to find a way to have the whole world galvanize around some of these issues that clearly are the most important ones we face. We'll go over here.
Hi there. I'm Tina Hobson, and I was one of the first people to walk into the new Department of Energy under Carter and was in charge of consumer affairs. And I wanted to mention to you, some of you brought out, how are you going to hit the younger people? One of the things through a government role, which we don't want to have to wait for that, but it can be state government, is remember the Department of Agriculture had the 4-H clubs? They started those so they could increase the understanding of agriculture with the parents, because the parents weren't doing it right. So they taught the kids through the 4-H club. So what we did in 1969 is we got $150,000 and gave $1,500 to individual community colleges all over the country. And we asked them to do what they could in their communities, what the students could do to impress people on how we needed to save energy. We knew something about climate change, but it wasn't dominant. It was saving energy. We had the most remarkable groups of junior colleges who work their own way in their individual communities. We got tremendous responses, all for $1,500. They went to grammar schools and they taught, they had little dramas that they set up. They worked with the community in many different ways. The kids loved it, the kids learned. They taught younger people. So there are a lot of ideas out there that are long before you came. We did we did Act 69 on the mall, where we brought in all of the energy conservation and all those kinds of things. So there are a lot of things that you can tap into that have been effective, and probably you can improve on that effectiveness. So I just wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, thank you for your work at the Department of Energy. Any comments on mobilizing through education, I guess?
I mean, I completely agree, and that's why we're doing these theatrical performances with virtual reality with high schoolers, because we've seen again and again that young people are a major conduit for change, and then also changing older generations, their behaviors and their attitudes. So, yeah, totally agree.
Can I ask a question? I wonder if, not under this administration, but a new one perhaps, I thought you were going to suggest we have climate clubs instead of 4-H clubs. We would have, you know, something equivalent. Yeah. I don't know if there is.
Lots of things you can look at.
Mhm.
I agree.
I
Congressman
think
Delaney last night was talking about a climate before he got smacked by Elizabeth Warren, was talking about a climate corps, which is a similar and interesting
Okay.
idea.
But these
Yeah.
are fun things.
Yeah.
These are things you, and
Yeah.
we had competition. We even got one that costs no money, where you take the janitors together with the kids in an elementary school, and you get them to work together, and the money they save goes into sports equipment, and it doesn't cost a thing. I mean, people learned how to help each other when you put it into that kind of format, which you're trying to do.
I agree 100%. I don't think our playbook has changed much since the 4-H days, and my mother was a proud member, so thank you. If you looked at an average campaign that we would be running with local partners somewhere, you know, in Indonesia or Brazil or Honduras, you would see a very similar playbook. Locally owned, locally operated, billboards, bumper stickers, games. Today we call it gamification, and it has to involve some technology, but it's really rudimentary. What is fun, what is engaging, and how do you meet people where they are? How do you meet people in their own context? So this just becomes part of, you know, a daily conversation. The thing that I don't think anybody mentioned here is that we found one little body of research within our organization involved a study of 84 different campaigns, 84 different 2-year campaigns, millions of data points, looking at knowledge and attitudes and actual behaviors before and after one of these behavior change campaigns. And then we did this enormous meta-analysis and meta-regression and found the bottom line was that the greatest driver of behavior change was actually a surprise to us. And it was simply interpersonal conversation. And so if you think about climate change today, and you think about the fact that the internal narrative is changing so much more quickly than the narrative in the press, that the social expectation today is, we just did the polling, more than 60% of Americans believe we should start changing our behavior right now because it's the right thing to do, but we don't believe that anyone else agrees with us. That is only addressed through interpersonal communications where we all agree, you know, maybe we should do X, Y, or Z. I'm doing it, she's doing it. I think I see a solar panel, I'm more likely to install solar. That's a fact. I see a charging station in my commute to work, I'm more likely to buy an EV. These are the little signals, the little subtle signals, and it's exactly what happened in a 4-H club in 1969. We haven't changed that much, unfortunately.
We're about at the end of our time. Let me see if there's one super quick question that somebody's dying to get in. Okay, well that side of the room has not had a question yet, so And I apologize for all of you. I think we will hang around a little bit afterwards and continue at least some of the conversation privately. But go ahead and wait for the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Jack Dowsman. I'm involved with ecumenism in the Catholic Church, and I'd like to know, are you leveraging religious communities? Because I hear it from a political side, but there's a wider community, and there's some divisions in there, but there's also a lot of momentum.
You should turn around and talk to the gentleman at your table who's the only guy to beat Mike Pence twice. who can tell you about a group called Eco America. They're doing amazing work with 10,000 congregations around the country. And the answer is, from our own experience, Muslim clerics in Zanzibar convincing local fishermen that this is their bounty and that these reefs must be protected, to Jehovah's Witnesses in the Caribbean, to Catholic priests, to there is no scripture in any religion that doesn't have an environmental theme of some kind, as you know. So there's ample, and that is such a powerful force for social pressure, for identity. We'd be crazy not to be meeting people where they are in their own religion and helping them find a pathway to contributing to this solutions.
The Catholic Church has played an incredibly important role in bringing the issues onto the center stage, and I think today's conversation has really cemented the connection with core religious values, and especially in the environmental justice area.
Are you familiar with Catherine Hayhoe's work? She's big in this area. She's a climate scientist, very active, and takes in her communication activities, a lot of it is on the religious side. So you should check out her work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, let me close with just a quick thanks to all of you for a really interesting and I think inspirational conversation. There's no question that the topic of climate change is the kind of defining challenge of our era. And I'm super encouraged that not only is the technology of the solution set unfolding, but I think the sophistication of the background set of ideas for what are the components of change that can work at the societal level, that can work at the level of the family breakfast table, can work at the level of the local political elections, the national elections, and at the level of the global dynamic. But I don't want to leave people with being too uplifted. The challenges we face are, incredibly grave, and I think that what we are seeing is the opening of a powerful and a compelling toolbox, and I hope that all of you will think about taking advantage of that as we work together to address this issue. So thank you very much for joining us today.